Hello and welcome to Sounding Board, a television production of Seroptimus International of Novato. My name is Madeline Peters, and my guest today is Magdalena Fitipaldi, whom I will have introduce herself in a moment. I'd like to at least tell you a little bit about Seroptimus and our mission. The Seroptimus mission is improving the lives of women and girls through programs leading to social and economic empowerment. Well, Magdalena, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
This is very exciting. Certainly your involvement in understanding females and their participation in politics and a leadership level is very exciting, and actually it's amazing for someone so young. But let me have you tell me a little bit about your background and sort of set the context for our discussion today.
So I am a senior at Dominican University of California, studying political science and international studies, and will be graduating in May, which is very exciting. And I'm very interested, like you said, in studying the leadership roles of women, particularly in politics, around the world, and in particular in Uruguay, which is the country that I'm from.
That's amazing. Now, how long have you been here in the United States?
I moved to the U.S. in 2002 when I was 10, so quite a long time.
So you actually have, at this point, you're sort of bilingual and bicultural. You have been in the United States for some length of time. And then tell me about how this interest occurred, how this happened, and what you've done, because you've done some very interesting sort of groundbreaking things in exploring your research topic.
Yeah, I've always been interested in politics and international studies, but it all started, this woman in politics, my interest in that started when I went to a conference in Washington, D.C. when I was a sophomore at Dominican, and it was a conference about women in politics in general, with regards to the U.S., but just a general about the topic, and that's when I started being interested in the subject, and I wondered what it was like in Uruguay, and so I started researching just for curiosity, just to see how the situation of women in politics was in Uruguay. And as I started doing more research and more research, it grew, and we saw that there was a big gap in research, and that the situation of women in politics in Uruguay was pretty serious. So that's
when you say serious, what does that mean? Just in terms of women in politics, that I know that suggests something to me. Could you elaborate on that?
Yes. So in Uruguay, it's a very unique case in terms of the subject, and it's really interesting because we find that Uruguay has it has very high human development index. It has economic growth, it has very stable political system, and there's a lot of gender equality. It's the most equal country in terms of gender in the region. And so it has a lot of factors that would point to a high number of women in political office. But what we find is just the opposite. Uruguay has one of the lowest levels of women in parliamentary office in Latin America and in the world, with just 13% of the parliament being women. And that is lower than any average around the world. So it's very startling, and that is why I started researching.
So you found that gap in the research in terms of one's expectations that you would find women in political leadership. But then how did you navigate? Because one of my notes is you interviewed the First Lady of Uruguay, and so how did this all happen for you? It's one thing to do the academic research, but you've been gathering field research for some time, going back to Uruguay and talking with people. So how did this all happen, and how did you make this all work?
So like I said, it started as just a curiosity that I had. And since I'm very curious, I started doing just preliminary research. And I went to my academic advisor at Dominican, who is Gigi Gocek, Professor Gigi Gocek, and she said, okay, well, keep reading, keep finding out. And so I went back and I kept on reading, and that's where we noticed the big gap, and we found out that a bigger project could come out of this.
Okay.
Because there is a lot of room for research, and that's when we started designing this project that has grown more than we thought it was going to grow, but that is very good. So that's kind of, it just started with curiosity, and then it turned into something more serious later.
But it also involves you contacting people and interviewing people and trips back to Uruguay to collect information. So how does that all happen?
So the project has two parts, one quantitative and one qualitative. The quantitative part consists of a survey that has reached nearly 900 respondents and is to the public of Uruguay, the general public above 18 years old. And that it was launched this past fall, and it is now closed, but we send it out through all means possible, social media. I went down there, like you said, I went to Uruguay 3 times to do field research, and just trying to get as many people to take that survey. And then on the other hand, we have the qualitative aspect of it, and that consisted of interviews with parliamentarians. And I got those, I just emailed them. I got their email from the parliament website, and I just emailed every parliamentarian in Uruguay, and the ones that got back, which ended up being 20 of them, were interviewed. And that one of the people that got back to me was, fortunately, the First Lady, Lucia Dobolansky, so I ended up interviewing her. So we hope that with those two aspects, the qualitative looking more at the details behind it, behind the lives of these politicians, how they got into power, because it is both men and women that I interviewed.
I see, okay.
Different parties, different ages, and really to see their life journey and how they got into politics. And then on the other hand, we have, the hard numbers of people, again, men and women, all ages, and to see kind of the opinion of the public.
I see. Now here, one of the things that you talk about are the different variables that explain things that you have to kind of keep in mind that affect or influence women being engaged in politics or not. So would you care to go into some of these? You have heritage rights, income inequality, educational opportunities, government structure.
Yes, so in this particular subject, it really depends on the context and on the country. So if we take a survey of the entire world and how women in politics are found in all countries, we see that there are many variables. Heritage rights, in many countries, women don't have the right to receive money from their family or their etc. So that can be an obstacle for women to get into office. We also have economic inequality, where women maybe are not able to enter the labor force, or they're not able to do so at the same level as their male counterparts. So that can also play an obstacle in the sense that they cannot finance a campaign or go out and find votes if they have no money to transport themselves. Mm-hmm. We also find education levels are even though now we see that more women are actually studying than men in a general sense, but that is also an obstacle. If women are not educated, then how are they going to get into office? And like I said, the case of Uruguay is very interesting because all of these big factors that in other countries point to the problem, in Uruguay they don't apply. Mm-hmm. Because fortunately, Uruguay, like I said, women are educated. In fact, there are more women in higher education than men. It's about 60%, I believe, or 65%. And there's income inequality, equality. There's still a gap between the income of a man and a woman, which there's in the US too and everywhere, mm-hmm. but it has the development of a first world country in terms of numbers and in terms of those variables that we see. So that is why there's definitely a variable missing. There's something missing that's not explaining it.
So that's what you're after.
And that is what we're after.
dynamics of elections and.
Yeah, that's actually something, the structure of the political system and the dynamics of the electoral system are two factors that play a major role in most countries where there's a deficiency in the number of women in office. And that is actually something that does play into Uruguay as well. And we're trying to see how it plays a role, because in many cases there is a direct obstacle that you can see written out in the law.
It's very clear.
Yes.
Yeah.
And in Uruguay, it's not so clear. So that is actually a variable that could work in Uruguay, be affecting the situation, but we're trying to see how it's doing so. It's
fascinating. So let's talk about, have you discussed your project a little bit more? Down here I have some percentages and how unusual. This is a unique case because of the economic growth and political stability, low levels of corruption. Can you speak to that? Can you speak to your project a little bit more specifically? I mean, I know generally you've said you have the quantitative and qualitative information that you're gathering.
So the percentages that you were reading are just to emphasize again how unique and weird in a way this case is, because like I said, 13% of women in Uruguay, in the Parliament of Uruguay, are women, whereas the average for the Americas and Europe is above 25%. Then the average for Asia, the Arab countries, and Sub-Saharan Africa is near the 20% mark. And here you have Uruguay, which has the HDI level, human development levels of countries in Europe, and some countries in Europe, or even higher, and here you have it with 13%. So that is what the percentages were alluding to.
It really is interesting too, because as you said, given when you compare, as you said, to the other countries, the involvement of women in politics, you would expect Uruguay to come close to women participation, at least comparable to the countries that you mentioned. So it makes 13% particularly low. It's like, here are the factors are in place to really support women in high political office, and something is amiss, something is not working. Why is the participation so low? So you're trying to figure out, I imagine you're trying to figure out what is operating. So it's not, you have the overt stuff, which on the overt level seems, there should be more involvement, but there's something going on underneath that you're trying to get at it. I would imagine, does that come out? I don't want you to give away your study, because I imagine you have a way to go to interpret all of this and present it, but what is it that you can share that you feel comfortable sharing at this point in your research?
Well, we're seeing that I think there is something to, we're seeing that there is the qualitative aspect and the journey that each person takes in order to get into office, the parliamentarians in office right now and the public. Again, the survey and the qualitative, both of them together, I think they will give us a complete picture. But it looks like there is something going on in how they get there in terms of each person and how they were raised, the politicized upbringing that they had or not. It doesn't seem, what I can tell you, which has been seen in other studies and which our study will probably corroborate, is that there doesn't seem to be a partisan divide or a gender divide or an age divide in terms of attitudes towards women, women in politics, or in terms of, for example, the quota law, which is the quota is a mechanism put in place in many democracies nowadays. It had been started in the Nordic countries, and it did work very well, so then it has been implemented in other governments as well. And it pretty much sets a quota for the amount of women that can be in parliament. There are different kinds of quota laws, but in Uruguay there's no divide in terms of who's against and who is for the quota. And that is something that you do see in other countries. For example, you see that the women are for the quota, the men are against, or the right parties have for or against, and the left parties are for or against. So we don't see that in Uruguay, which makes it even more interesting.
It's really an anomaly then,
yes,
in many ways.
Yeah.
So it's fascinating. It must be fascinating for you to be living and breathing all of this information, plus your own cultural connection to the country as well.
Certainly.
Well, I imagine it's not just a book that you're coming out with, it's probably an entire series.
Oh my.
But it's an interesting position for you to be in. And let me ask this question here is, here you were focusing on Uruguay and involvement of women in politics, and as a result of your research, you really had to look globally at patterns of behavior, political behavior. So that gave you, I would imagine that gave you a unique perspective, because now it's not, here you are as a member of the culture in the country, studying political involvement of women in the culture in the country. But it's in the larger context of seeing these larger trends. So can you speak to that a little bit? And your thinking as you were unearthing all of this information, more on from the view from 30,000 feet on a global view.
Yeah, it's definitely very interesting to be doing this research outside of Uruguay, even though I have had the opportunity to go back and do field research there. Having the outside perspective is definitely something that I value and that has given me a different way of approaching the project. And yes, definitely nowadays, especially with living in such a globalized world where I do something and it affects someone hundreds and hundreds of miles away from me, it's crucial to always take into consideration what's going on around the world, not only even in the region of the country that you're studying, but just everywhere else, because, well, we see it in the news all the time, that, international influence makes something happen or not happen in a certain country. We see it a lot with conflicts. Well, we also see it with women. When the international when the international community puts pressure or doesn't put pressure, then things happen or they don't happen. So I think that in that sense, and regarding the project in the case of Uruguay, there are a lot, like the quota that was implemented in these previous elections in Uruguay. That was taken from an example of the European countries and the evaluation of how it turned out there, and then it was applied to the case of Uruguay. But like I mentioned before, the key, I think, to this whole subject of women in politics is to first and foremost research about it and analyze it and really take into consideration the context. That's definitely what I'm taking, the number one thing that I'm taking out of all this, that context is key, because you cannot extrapolate an idea or a mechanism or a method or anything from another country and simply apply it to a society and a system of government in another place, because it may not work. You really have to take everything into consideration. So when you look at this global perspective, when you see the global image of how women in different countries are seen in politics, I think that we always need to take that into consideration, because we may see a lot of women in some countries. For example, in Africa, you see a lot of women in politics. And it makes you wonder why in so many other variables, the ones that we had to be talking about, Africa tends to be lower, and here it is with a lot of women. Well, maybe, don't quote me on this, but some studies may say that, for example, there was a lot of conflict in some areas, so there were no men to take office, so the women took office. So not just, it's a double-edged sword. It's really important to have the international perspective, but when we do have it, we need to make sure that there's also a very context-based, specific for each country that you need to also consider, because you can't make a generalized assumption about all of them. So I think that has been very important for me to take into consideration when I'm approaching this project. And thinking that Uruguay is its own case. I need to analyze it and then take the international perspective to see how it applies, how it compares to others, and whether other methods that have been used elsewhere can be applied to the context of Uruguay and be successful in improving the number of women in office.
This brings up an interesting point, because here you are, and this is something that you said too about whatever happens here, there's an influence on a larger context. And so the question that I have for you now, do you see your influence in doing this in a larger context? Have you had, here you are doing this project, but it's more than just the project. It's more than just a requirement for your degree. It has many more implications than that. Do you look at yourself taking on this project and understand or think about the impact that you as Magdalena has on the worldview?
Yeah, so that's very true. At the very beginning, when I first went to Professor Gocek and told her this idea, I came with the thinking of, I want to fix this. Look how little women there are in Uruguay. I need to fix this. And she's like, wait, first you need to figure out what's happening,
yes,
and then you can fix it. So it has always been in my mind, and it's always been my idea to not just leave it as a research project in which I ask a question and I try to answer it, in this case, what's the problem, but then take the results of that and implement it or in a practical matter, in something tangible. Mm-hmm. Whether it will be me doing it or someone else, I don't mind. I just want something to be done. I don't want my thesis or this project, this book, or whatever it turns out to be, to just be in a shelf. So that has always been very important to me. And I do hope that it will, the data will bring about some sort of result that will be beneficial, that I can give back to Uruguay and other cases around the world that are maybe, in the same situation where there's something missing. It is a subject, fortunately, that has been talking about a lot more now. I see it, you see it on the news, the He for She campaign of the United Nations. There's a lot of talk about women that you didn't see some years prior.
That's right, yeah. So your work is a contributing factor in moving that discussion further, and your actions in this project are, you're shining the light on this situation here, at least within your home country, but also sort of stepping back and seeing how this plays out internationally with your international views. That's quite an accomplishment in these efforts. We don't have that much time left. This is fascinating. It's still, and I really commend you for your work and the seriousness of your scholarship and for the voice that you give to this topic, both in terms of your home country and on an international scale. What is the way forward? You talked about, making change, and you also did emphasize knowing the context. Is there anything else that you would add to that?
I think that we're at a prime time to be studying this subject and proposing solutions all around the world, because as we were just mentioning, the subject of women in politics is rising, and that is something very good, so now is the time. So I think that the way forward is to continue studying, and really what is needed is the political will. And you see that in all the cases, whether it be because of heritage rights, because of income inequality, education inequality, whatever the problem may be in a given context or country, if the political will is behind it, then change can happen.
I see, okay.
And so that is really the key. For us as researchers and academics on this side, to always, take into consideration the context and really do a research that is whole, well-rounded, and that can get at the problem of the specific thing that you're looking at, And then in terms of the people that are actually in politics working, I think the political will, that's number one, because when there's political will, things change and things happen.
That's right.
And there will be more women in office.
So this is Magdalena Fitipaldi here as activist for the voice of women in politics. Well, I want to thank you very much. I know you're busy analyzing your data and getting ready to wrap this study up, but I really appreciate your taking the time to be here and to share your perspective. I really admire your work and your ability to articulate and shine the light on this question, not just within your home country, but on an international stage as well. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
This is a delight. This is a Sounding Board, a television production of Seroptimus International of Novato. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Buck Institute for Research on Aging for allowing us to use their television facility, and the Seroptimus International crew. These are all Seroptimus members who volunteer their time to be here. We have Patricia Hess and Freda Kaplan as crew members, and then also Leon Johnson, our studio engineer, who works with us to make this work and to share it with the world. Thank you very much. My name is Madeline Peters, and our guest today was Magdalena Fitipaldi on the role of women in political leadership in Uruguay.